This is your US Daily Rundown from LinkedIn News for Tuesday, February 16th. A significant shift is quietly taking place in the US labor market, according to Bloomberg, as a wave of people 55 and older flee the labor force. Scores of disgruntled boomer workers have given up looking for work since the pandemic began, with the participation rate of workers over 55 slumping by 2% since last March, equating to the loss of 2 million workers from the labor force. Some 2.7 million jobs for workers under the age of 55 have been created since August, with just 28,000 jobs created for workers over 55 in the same period. An Arctic blast of cold weather is delivering punishing temperatures across the nation, with Texan cities like Dallas and Houston grinding to a halt as they encounter especially brutal conditions. Officials there said the freezing temperatures were likely to blame for the deaths of 2 people in the Houston area. Most of the central corridor of the U.S. has entered a deep freeze, triggering rolling power outages from North Dakota to Texas. Initial fears that COVID-19 related workers' compensation claims would overwhelm insurance carriers and business groups haven't panned out, with a significant percentage of claims being denied, according to the Wall Street Journal. That's partly due to the fact that shutdowns and remote work reduced the numbers of workplace injuries, but data also show that many COVID-related claims were denied because workers faced a higher bar proving they were infected on the job, even in states that give some employees, including frontline medical workers and firefighters, a presumption of eligibility. Now for today's Idea of the Day. Identify the right risks to take, says WLJ Advisors CEO Whitney Johnson. People often take on new assignments, side projects, volunteer efforts, or further their education to develop new skills, gain new insight, or build experience for the resume. The goal is to take the right risks that can propel you forward. That was your daily rundown. Join the conversation on today's stories directly on LinkedIn.
Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live. Workplace female rivalry makes for very toxic environments, and yet it's an endemic problem seemingly too hard to solve. We speak with 2 experts who've studied the issue extensively to get to the root of the issue and find the tools needed to fix it. All that and your answers to our poll next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's February 16th, and here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. Elon Musk pitches Miami tunnel, Arctic blast cripples Texas Midwest, and Arne Sorensen, Marriott CEO, dies at the age of 62. Let's take a deeper look into that story. Sorensen, who was credited with creating the world's largest hotel chain, was diagnosed with stage 2 pancreatic cancer in May 2019, but continued to serve as Marriott's CEO. He was the company's first chief executive without the Marriott surname. He leaves behind a wife and 4 children. Arne Sorensen was a good friend of LinkedIn News, and here he is sitting down with LinkedIn's editor-in-chief, Dan Roth, in 2019, giving his career advice for young professionals.
There are a few things which are sort of regular bits of advice. One is just say yes. And maybe this is particularly the case for folks who have a bit less confidence. And sometimes we talk about this in the context of gender, where a man will be given an opportunity and sort of say, I deserve this and I'm going for it. And a woman will be given the same opportunity and think, well, I'm not sure if I'm ready for it. But if somebody is delivering that opportunity for you, you may not feel like you're ready for it, but they feel like you're ready for it. Say yes, take it. They're almost always going to be looking out for you and themselves because they think you will be doing well in that job. So say yes is a big piece of it.
Well, Arne, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you here today.
Arne, you will be missed. And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. We've been polling professionals on the LinkedIn news page, and we want to hear from you too in the stream with the poll that we have for you today. We want to know, how important is company culture and feeling supported at work? Is it A, very important, B, not important, or C, it depends? We mostly want to hear your comments, so let us know your vote in the stream, but also your thoughts behind your vote, and we'll reveal the results at the end of today's show. Why do women sometimes not support each other at work? It's a question that is both stereotypical as well as something that has researchers pining over the answer for quite some time. And our guests on today's show will be discussing just that. We have Amy Gallo from Harvard Business Review as well as Marianne Cooper from Stanford joining us to discuss this Very controversial topic for a Tuesday. Amy and Marianne, thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thanks for having us. Good to be here.
All right, Amy, let's start with you. I wanted to bring you on the show because you posted on LinkedIn that you almost didn't want to post on LinkedIn about this topic because it is somewhat controversial. I think it is for a lot of working women. Why is it controversial? Talk to us a little bit about your struggle with this concept.
Sure. So, and I put the post on LinkedIn was related to a book I'm working on about difficult people at work, how to deal with difficult people. And I was not at all intending to cover what people call the queen bee syndrome. And yet so many people kept reaching out when I was talking about the book or publishing about the book and saying, you have to cover women undermining women. So I really started to dig into the research. Marianne's wrote a wonderful article for The Atlantic about this. There's lots of different researchers here in the States as well as in Europe who have been looking at this. And one of the things, the reason it's so controversial is that the framing of the syndrome, this queen bee behavior, the perception of it, the discussion around it is laden with gender bias. And so it's really hard to separate, are we seeing behavior that's truly problematic, or are we seeing gender bias at work? And that's where the real controversy comes from, is this, this lived experience that people have of, as a woman, feeling undermined by other women at work. Is that, a true experience, or again, are you experiencing, and is that other person experiencing and carrying out gender bias?
And it's almost impossible to separate the two, which makes this topic so controversial in terms of discussion. Marianne, talk to us a little bit about the research. What do we actually know about this?
Yeah, well, I'll just to add to Amy's point, there's no equivalent queen bee term for men. And so the origin of this all starts with the fact that conflict between men is seen as normal and conflict between women is seen as abnormal, which is sort of part of the gender bias that we're talking about here. But the underlying sort of dynamic that occurs with the queen bee dynamics is that it's a response among some women to gender discrimination. And it's sort of a two-parter here. We see queen bee behaviors among women who actually don't really highly identify as women, in the sense of it's not really important to how they see their lives. They're not like a part of a women's network. They just want to, do well at work. They just want to get that promotion, but being a woman isn't totally salient to their day-to-day life. But in response to gender discrimination, they can pick up on the fact that often gender is a liability. Being a woman in the workplace can be a liability. You have to prove yourself more. So they start to engage in what we call distancing strategies. So that you distance yourself from the social group to which you belong that is devalued. And so you can start saying things like, well, I'm not like most women. I've always prioritized my career. Or I'm not like most women. I'm more like a guy. And that can also translate into kind of undermining behaviors. But it's not sort of a catty gene women have. It's a strategy for sort of individual mobility. How do I get ahead in this context of gender inequality? And it's not just women where you see this, other groups too. When you're sort of a lower status minority group, you kind of distance from others as a way to get ahead. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just explaining why it happens.
It's a self-preservation mechanism that some women are unfortunately forced to deploy. Amy and Marianne, I'm going to say hello to some members who are joining us in this stream. We have Sandra from Alabama, Aleem from Pakistan, Bryn from Chicago, Stephen from New Jersey, and Thomas from Switzerland. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. And we have a comment here from Christine who says, women are usually not the ones in power, and when they are, they may be trying to hold on to their position, which gets to what Marianne was just talking about. Amy, strong words from Marianne there, saying being a woman in the workplace is often a liability. Curious, going back to your book, is this the most challenging relationship that people face in the workplace? Are there tougher ones?
Oh boy, I mean, there are a lot of tough ones. I do think what's one of the challenges with queen bee behavior is that it's not only is it a response to gender bias, but it also violates our stereotypes about what women should do at work. So why it can feel particularly harmful is because our stereotypes, even as women, or our expectations are that other women should be caring and nurturing, and they should watch out for the collective. So of course, if a woman has made it to a senior position in an organization, we of course expect them to watch out for other women who are rising up the ranks. And, to Marianne's point, we don't expect that of men. You rarely hear men criticize for not supporting junior men in their organization. They're just a bad boss or a political operator, right? They don't get this queen bee label. So I think part of the reason it can be so painful for people who are experiencing it is that we want women to support us. But the question is that a fair expectation? And what we know from the research is that that's really steeped in these gender expectations that are unfair to women.
And Marianne, what Amy's really getting at are just these unconscious biases that we all hold about what a leader is supposed to look like. But at least you and I, Marianne, we've been having this conversation for years now. You've been researching it for years now. The things that we're saying, I hope, are not new to a lot of people in the stream. So why are these unconscious biases so persistent in terms of what we expect, particularly of female leaders?
Small question to get going here. Well, we're talking about systemic inequalities and cultural beliefs that are still widely pervasive and durable. We might all totally believe that women can lead just as well as any man, but when it comes down to implicit biases, and studies continue to find that our perceptions of leadership map on more with the characteristics that we think men have, less so with women. And so this puts women in a situation of having to continually prove themselves over and over again. So leadership is still very, very much seen as a masculine way of being in the world. And that sets women up to have to do more to be seen as a similarly competent leader.
Absolutely. Amy and Marianne, I'm going to bring in some comments because we have so many joining us in the stream right now. We have Holly who say, I've seen women in my career who have an attitude of, I made it where I am fighting hard and no one gave me a break, so I'm not going to give the next generation a break. If I had to do it, you need to do it as well. Holly, thanks for that perspective. Lynn says, I notice a high level of risk avoidance when it comes to women supporting women. And Ashita says, it is a very powerful yet an honest topic. Women cannot move forward unless we help each other. So thanks for those perspectives in the stream. We appreciate you joining our conversation. But let's just get down to brass tacks here. This is a problem that's actually costing employers money and time and productivity of their employees. I actually want to bring up a graphic that we have for you in the stream right now, where we can actually prove that this is costing a lot of money for people who are companies who are just having to deal with this. We have the graphic that I was referring to is this. Yep, what happens when someone is mean to you at work. 66% of people, they say their performance declines. They are intentionally decreasing their work ethic. They're increasing their time at work, and their quality of work also lessens. And this is costing about $14,000 per employee by some estimates. So Marianne, why aren't companies figuring this out? Why aren't they just deciding how to solve some of these transgressions so they can make a better bottom line here?
Creating civil workplaces is a really big task. This is about training, awareness, not tolerating bad behavior, from top performers. So it's a big issue to tackle. And I think it can maybe feel a little bit overwhelming because there are many different reasons why people behave badly at work. My guess is queen bee behaviors are actually not a significant part of it as a driver of all of this, but it certainly can be a response to a very dysfunctional workplace. But ultimately, if you're coming down to a very kind of tactical way of thinking about this, too many workplaces are allowed to be unprofessional and dysfunctional and uncivil. And there's all kinds of consequences to people at the individual level, but obviously at the company and organizational level as well. So it's important to take the steps to create this is the way we're going to work here. This is a positive environment. And then actually the most important part is accountability when those things are transgressed. Because if somebody misbehaves or bullies or is toxic in the workplace and they're not held accountable, it's really demoralizing, and it just kind of lets in a lot of other bad behavior as well.
Well, and even worse, they're often not only are they're held accountable, but they're rewarded, right? So many goals are set around, revenue targets, very concrete, quantifiable targets that people get rewarded for, and very rarely are people fairly and thoroughly evaluated on how they treat others. And I think that's one of the key things is to really you say we are not going to promote people, no matter how much money they bring in, no matter how good they are with clients, no matter, what they produce for the organization, if they mistreat others. I think that really has to be a zero tolerance in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And Amy, in researching for your book, what does that zero tolerance actually look like? I see many managers joining us on the stream right now, and I'm sure that they want to work in workplaces where incivility is not something that is rewarded. But how do you actually track and measure that against some of the more quantifiable metrics that you're just mentioning?
It's hard to do, because really the incivility is in the eye of the beholder in some ways. And certainly what I might feel is rude behavior, a curt email or a snarky comment in a Zoom meeting might to someone else just roll off their back. So it's really hard to say, this is the mistreatment I'm experiencing. And as you said, where are you going to survey everyone's coworkers and say, do they treat you fairly? There are actually organizations that are doing that will look at, what do your colleagues say about working with you, and use that as part of your performance evaluation. But it is hard, to your point, Caroline, to quantify it. And I think that's where really things get tricky. And I'm actually curious, Marian, maybe you've seen in your consulting work or in your research organizations that have been able to quantify that. I haven't seen much of that myself.
Yeah, there's certainly a little bit of subjectivity, but I think broadly there's just, I would call it ways of being in the world that we can all agree upon are professional, and ways of being in the world that we can all agree upon are unprofessional. And so then you can create, partly it's how far off the rails as a company, what you would do, but there's a sort of diagnosis part about like, where are things going wrong? Is it certain divisions, just certain teams? Is it systemic across a company? What is the occupational culture like? But usually interviews and surveys are a good way of getting at it. And a lot of it comes down to, do people feel respected? Do they feel safe? Do they feel like there's a professional environment in this company? And you can get at that through interviews, focus groups, and surveys. The real question is, why don't more companies want to get a sense of this? And then when they get the sense of it, what are the next steps to take? And to Amy's point, there's no reason to invest a lot of money and time and energy into diagnosing your culture if you're just going to keep rewarding the jerk. It doesn't matter, because it's basically, talking out of both sides of your mouth, and employees really pick up on that very quickly. So you have to be ready to make a sincere commitment to a professional work environment where people feel respected. And the reason to do that is because it's not just the brilliant jerks that bring in money to an organization. Actually, per the statistics you just showed, when you have an environment where people feel like they can do work and be respected, their productivity is going to be greater, their creativity is going to be greater, and you get a benefit and a reward that way as well, organizationally.
But Marianne, when we're talking about the specific jerk that we're talking about on today's show is not the stereotypical Silicon Valley texter, white male who we typically talk about when we think about a brilliant jerk. For this context, we're speaking about another woman, a woman who is feeling threatened in the workplace because of gender biases that are leading to bad behavior. Mm-hmm. How should we roll back the onion a little bit to get to that? Because there's a reason that this queen bee, this woman, is showing up in the workplace a certain way. She feels threatened. So how do we balance that out?
Well, so I guess I would build on your point in a different way, which is those companies, whatever we want to take, the prototypical Silicon Valley company that's going off the rails, that's actually where I would expect to see more queen bee behaviors, because queen bee behaviors emerge in male-dominated environments in which women are devalued. So when usually there's not a lot of women in those kinds of organizations, whether it's tech or any other industry. And in that case, gender is a liability. There's a palpable sexism that's going on there. So you're not going to signal, I'm a woman. I mean, this is sort of what's going on. And so if you're kind of muting and trying to distance yourself so that you can get ahead, that's when these kinds of responses emerge. So they're really part of a whole ecosystem in which people are not being their best selves, for sure.
Well, and I think you alluded to this at the beginning, Marianne, too, is that it's also about how we perceive competition between women, right? But there's really great research from Leah Shepard at Washington State University that shows that the same interaction when it's between two men versus when it's between two women, we have a much more negative connotation of those women competing. So when we see women competing, which is there's scarcity of resources in organizations, whether that's funding, promotions, the attention of a manager, prime opportunities, projects to work on, there is going to be a scarcity and there's going to be competition for those. So, but the problem is when we see women do it, even in an organization that's predominantly women, we have a negative association. And so we start to label that as queen bee, or she's undermining women, when it could just be what is typical behavior in an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more nuance here that we have to unpack. Women and minorities are actually penalized when they're shown to support women and minorities at work. Is that right, according to the research?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. You sort of like see at every place we go in this conversation, it's like, it's so frustrating. You hit a roadblock, right? So the alternative is, so when women who like highly identify with women, they're a part of the women's network, they're like all in. When they experience gender discrimination, they respond by wanting to invest in other women and find opportunities for other women. But we also know another stream of research is that when women and people of color sort of stand up and do this sort of equity kind of work, they can face stigmas and penalties for doing that. And so, we like to believe that we can't be biased against our own group, so to speak, but the research shows that we can. And sometimes people have to get ahead, unfortunately. But even when we're sort of the perfect supporter of our other women colleagues, that may be great for them, but we may face blowback personally for doing that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, and the answer, I think, Marion, we agree, the answer is not for women and people of color to not do these equity, the sort of demographic balance work that many are doing and that they do suffer penalty from, but that we normalize it so that there's more people doing that work, so that it's not, it doesn't become something that one woman in, HR, she's really, she's just cares all about promoting women, right? It becomes something that the entire organization is focused on. So it's not a matter of who's rewarded and who's not. It's that everyone is rewarded for doing that because that's what the organizational goal is.
Well, Amy, Marianne, I'm seeing a very heated conversation in the stream right now. We have hellos too from Mario in California, Lynn from Illinois, Nicely from Virginia, Lori from Canada, and Georgia from Jamaica. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. And Elaine says it's even tougher when you're a woman of color. Hear ya. That's definitely a great point that we need to bring into this conversation. And Holly asks, a big question from Holly. So everyone just get ready for this one. How do we solve this? What are the top 3 things a workplace can do?
Yeah. Can we talk about the woman of color? I'm glad that the listener brought that up, because I do think my understanding, Marion, you probably know the research better, is that most of the research is done that's done about the queen bee behaviors is around white women. And there's not good research, as far as I understand, around women of color and whether this label is used with women of color more or less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Most research on gender, unfortunately, has been predominantly done with white women. So we're totally missing an intersectional lens here. And so I think it's to be seen whether or not, the research will continue to show these dynamics, except I would say that a lot of people so there's research on how people in immigrant groups, for example, face a similar kind of dynamic that women can, and use these distancing strategies to get ahead. So really it's sort of what happens when you're in a particular structural situation where you are a member of a group that has less power as a minority group, and how you respond. So it's likely that we could see these kinds of dynamics among many groups, any group that is a non-dominant group.
And part of what I find so fascinating about this is that in order to get to the root of the problem here, we kind of have to recognize our own biases that we may have against people that are in our same group. Amy alluded earlier that people tend to believe that they can't be biased against someone who looks like them and has the same lived experience as them. So how do we unpack that? How do we confront the biases that we all bring into the office, virtually or not, every day?
Yeah. When it comes to the queen bee behaviors, I had a female boss earlier in my career who I certainly in my head, I don't think I ever said it out loud, but I labeled as a queen bee. I thought she was unsupportive of me trying to balance my, work and family life. I thought she was sort of trying to undermine me. But I've looked back on it, especially now with this research in mind, and I think, she just wasn't a good boss. It wasn't about her gender. And in fact, most of my bosses in my career have been women, and the majority of them, truly with this one exception, have been incredibly supportive and big promoters of my career. And I do think that's one of the things is to really talk about, is to sort of disrupt this narrative, right, of that women are undermining women at work, that competition between women is unhealthy or unprofessional, and really for us to be talking about how much support and what that means, how much support we get from other women and what that means for the organizations, because there are lots of benefits we know when women do support women and when women are supported in general in workplaces.
Yeah, Marianne, talk to us a little bit about those benefits. I'm curious to see what the research says there. But also what Amy just said is that she caught an assumption that she made about just a bad boss years later. So how do we catch those assumptions in real time so that we're not creating these narratives of hysteria and queen bee in our head?
Yeah, so I think it takes a lot to really think through what it means to say we all exhibit bias. So that means that we actually all exhibit bias. And so I say that sort of patly, but that means that when you're having a reaction to someone about their management style, you need to be really thinking about, well, how is our gender and race and even social class coming into how I'm making sense of the way this person is behaving. And one way to do that is to compare, okay, well, how would I feel if this person were a man, or, this or that, to kind of suss out, like, where are these expectations of yours coming from? And so you're trying to create a fairer, I think, evaluation of this person. I think that's a first place to start. But really, the longer, I rarely give a talk where this question doesn't come up. And I think that it is such an area of fascination that women could keep other women down, so to speak. But really, it's not, it's a response to a structural inequality. It's not just how women are. So there's sort of two bias moments there of learning. One is that you can be biased in your assessments, and that we have this broader gender bias or sort of stereotype about women, that they're catty. And those two things together is what kind of creates the cultural foundation, I would say, of this whole problem. The answer is to what Amy said, just better managers, right? Usually when you're having an issue at work, you could think about the particularities of that person, but often it's just bad management is happening and is probably allowed to be happening.
And bad management, unfortunately, is pervasive across corporate America. Is there a generational component to us, Marianne or Amy? Are your kids going to save us from this crisis? Do they think about it differently than we do?
It's funny. I was talking, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I was talking to her about this chapter in my book, and she's like, what is that? What is queen bee? Like, I do think, and I actually, because she's learning at home some days, I was actually overhearing her health teacher lead a discussion the other day about gender bias and leadership and who do we think of as leaders. So I do certainly have some hope that things are, that the next generation is better educated about these biases and will, interrupt them and challenge them. But we just have to be very careful. I think, the way I've heard Ibram Kendi talk about systemic racism is that, we're just all being rained on by racist thoughts and sexist thoughts at all times. And we, in that way, we often hold them without realizing it. And I think we have to really, it's got to be quite intentional, the way that we interrupt and challenge ourselves around these biases. And that's interpersonal, right? With me and my experience with my female boss, that's generational, trying to talk to our kids in different ways. And that's certainly organizational too, of making it okay to have discussions about where do we see bias showing up in the decisions we make and the interactions we have, so that we can constantly be self-correcting and identifying.
Well, actually, Amy, I have a question here in the stream from Talia, who wants to know, how do you point out a toxic manager who doesn't show the same behavior to top management? So this is probably someone who's good at what we like to call in the professional world, managing up, but not so much managing down. So how do you speak to the boss's boss that, hey, they're not doing as good a job with you as they are with me?
Yeah. I think anytime you're thinking about escalating bad behavior to certainly your boss's boss, you want to have very clear documentation. So you really don't want it to be just, I'm raising this concern, I'm the only one experiencing it, it happened 3 times and no one else observed it. But really, can you find others who are experiencing the same treatment? Can you get documentation, whether it's an email or whether you're actually just making notes of what the person said and when they said it? Really trying to build evidence so that the person who you're raising the concern to really can't say, dismiss your concerns as just one person complaining. The other thing is really think about what your boss's boss cares about and show how this behavior is hindering that boss from getting what they need. Because in some ways, if they're not experiencing the mistreatment or they're not having any sort of hindrance because of it, they have no motivation to fix it. So really figure out what is it, is there a certain project that might be at risk? Is it that they care about ideally having an equitable workplace and that this manager is undermining that? What is it that they're trying to achieve that they're not going to get because of the way this manager is treating you and ideally, or not ideally, but others on the team?
Marianne, anything to add there?
Well, document, and then, the reporting structure needs to be in place at an organization. I think the tension is, yes, document, yes, make sure you have a solid, tight case. And then the issue, though, becomes that if you go forward, there can be blowback. Again, which is why we can't put all the onus on the individual. Organizations, so good management doesn't just happen, right? It has to be created and it has to be monitored and people have to be held accountable. So really, if a toxic situation has developed, there needs to be multiple paths to fix it that don't just rely on an individual being like, it's happening to me. So, because it's really hard to be that person and it's really hard to speak up. So ultimately, organizations have to create these cultures of not just professionalism, but of speaking up and raising concerns and making kind of channels and pathways for employees to be able to come forward and speak their truth. Because too many people are mistreated at work every day.
Way too many people. And from the stream, I feel like we could talk about this all day. But Amy, Marianne, thank you so much for unpacking some of the biases that we all hold when we walk into the workplace and for unpacking this just very controversial topic that I'm glad we got to discuss on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, that was Amy Gallo from Harvard Business Review, as well as Marianne Cooper from Stanford, unpacking the controversial term of the queen bee. I want to thank them for joining us on today's show. They're both great voices to both follow on LinkedIn as well for more on this topic and more. And I want to reveal the results of the poll that we had for you in the stream today. We asked you, how important is company culture and feeling supported at work? A vast majority of you, 95%, say that it's very important. And we have a couple percentage of you saying it's not important and a few saying that it depends. So thanks for joining us on the poll and in the stream today. All right, tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, it's typically, I'm assuming, something that you felt at some point during this pandemic, and it's accelerated continue feelings of running on empty. I'm talking about burnout. We speak with one expert on the state of it and what can be done about it. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.